The stars glittered in the blackness of space as the Selenary Empire, the most powerful and ruthless force in the galaxy, made its way toward Earth. They were ready to crush this small, insignificant planet, like they had with so many others. The Selenary had conquered countless worlds, wiping out civilizations and sending every resistance to the void. Their warriors were elite, trained to perfection, unbeatable, and highly disciplined. They feared no enemy, especially not one as weak as humanity. Earth had just begun to make its mark in the galaxy. Their technology was primitive compared to the Selenaries, and their ships were slow, clunky, and outclassed by any of the galactic empires. The Selenary had taken one look at Earth's people, their cities, their armies, and thought, "This will be easy." There was no reason to fear them. Humanity was just a minor annoyance in the grand scheme of things. The Selenary fleet arrived in Earth's orbit, towering ships lined up like predators circling their prey. Each ship was a city in itself, bristling with weapons of unimaginable power. Their goal was simple: destroy Earth's military, take control of the planet, and send a message to the rest of the galaxy that no one could stand in their way. On the surface of Earth, the situation looked grim. The world leaders were in panic. Their armies were outgunned, and their ships were outmatched. The Selenary had arrived with overwhelming force, and humanity was about to face extinction. All hope seemed lost. But there was one thing the Selenary hadn't counted on: the sheer unpredictability of humans. Earth's last hope didn't lie in their military power or advanced technology. No, it lay in their most unexpected resource: a group of drunk, out of shape, and seemingly useless heroes. Captain Tommy Carter, a retired war hero, was a man known for his hard-drinking ways and his uncanny ability to get into trouble. He wasn't part of the elite military unit or the government's special forces. In fact, Tommy was barely on anyone's radar anymore. He spent his days sitting at the local bar, reminiscing about his glory days and laughing with old friends. He hadn't fired a weapon in years, and he certainly hadn't seen combat in a long time. But when the Selenary made their move, Tommy's name came up. He was called in, not for his tactical brilliance, not for his advanced skills, but because of his reputation for being a stubborn survivor. It was said that Tommy never backed down from a fight, no matter how hopeless it seemed. Whether he was sober or drunk, he always managed to pull through. Tommy was more than surprised when the government called on him. The situation was desperate, and they needed someone to lead a team of veterans, a team of those who had seen better days, a group of washed-up warriors, not fit for battle in the eyes of most. But the leaders of Earth had no choice. The Selenary were coming, and Tommy and his crew were all they had left. The government briefed Tommy and his team in a cold, sterile room. "We're out of time," the general said, his voice grim. "We don't have the resources to fight back. Our best warriors and ships have already been overwhelmed. But we got a small fleet left, a handful of ships and fighters. It's not much, but we've managed to load them up with advanced weaponry. You're the last chance we've got." Tommy looked around at his team, a mix of old soldiers, misfits, and outcasts. Each one of them had a unique skill, but none of them were fit for a fight, at least by normal standards. A mechanic who drank too much, a former sniper with a terrible sense of direction, a hacker who couldn't stay sober for more than 5 minutes, and a combat medic who'd been kicked out of every major military force for his reckless behavior. They were the drunkest and most unpredictable crew ever assembled. But Tommy wasn't worried. He looked at the group and gave them a sly smile. "We may not have the fancy tech, the best weapons, or the most disciplined troops," he said with a chuckle. "But we've got something the Selenary will never understand: chaos. And chaos is what wins wars." The rest of the team nodded, some slurring their words, others laughing. They weren't exactly the best at following orders, but they knew how to fight when it counted. And if there was one thing they had in abundance, it was heart. As the crew stumbled onto their ship, the Bender, Tommy could already feel the tension building. The Selneri had no idea what was coming. They had sent their best, their most powerful warriors. The Bender was nothing more than an old transport ship, patched up and retrofitted with whatever technology the crew could scrounge up. It wasn't built for war, but the crew wasn't going to let that stop them. They had the element of surprise, and they were going to use it to their advantage. The Selneri fleet, on the other hand, was already preparing for what they thought would be a slaughter. They had underestimated humanity. But this time, they would learn the hard way that humans were not to be underestimated. Especially not when their last line of defense was a crew of drunk heroes ready to cause havoc in ways the Selneri couldn't possibly imagine. As the Bender launched into the void of space, the crew laughed and toasted their last drink. They weren't heroes by any normal measure. They weren't trained soldiers, and they weren't sober, but they had something that Selneri didn't: unpredictability. And in the chaotic world of war, that just might be enough. The Bender rocketed through space, its engines roaring like an old, malfunctioning machine. Inside the ship, chaos was already unfolding in the best possible way. The crew, still buzzing from their last round of drinks, had taken their positions, though not in any sort of traditional military manner. Tommy Carter, the crew's leader, sat in the pilot's seat, his hand gripping the control panel with a level of focus that only came when he was in a tight spot. The others were scattered around the ship, stumbling to their stations and muttering to each other. "This is going to be easy," said Carl, the ship's mechanic, as he kicked back in his seat, cracking open another can of space beer. "They're just a bunch of fancy military men. We've got this." "Easy for you to say," mumbled Greg, the sniper, as he tried to sober up enough to see straight. His sniper rifle was strapped to his back, and he was trying, with little success, to focus on the controls. He had the sharpest eyes of anyone on the crew, but at the moment, those eyes were struggling to keep track of the instruments. "I can barely see straight." Tommy's voice cut through the chaos. "Focus, people. We've got one shot at this. If we screw it up, we're toast. So let's do what we do best: cause chaos." As the ship neared the Selneri fleet, the tension inside the Bender could be cut with a knife. The crew had no illusions. They were outmatched, outgunned, and outclassed by a long shot. But they didn't have to win by force. No, they had something better: unpredictability. "We've got a plan, right?" Greg asked, looking around nervously. "I mean, it's not just drunken chaos, is it?" Tommy grinned, his teeth shining under the dim lights of the ship. "Oh, it's chaos, all right. But it's controlled chaos." "What does that even mean?" Carl asked, scratching his head. Tommy chuckled. "It means that while they're focused on trying to figure out what we're doing, we'll be doing something else entirely. It's all about distracting them, confuse them, make them question their tactics, and when they're looking the other way, we hit 'em where it hurts." The Selneri fleet loomed ahead. Their massive ships glinted in the void of space, a shining wall of destruction. They were confident. They were ready for a quick, clean victory. They were used to seeing their enemies bow before them. But Earth's last line of defense wasn't bowing. They were just getting started. The Bender slid into position, hidden behind a few asteroids, just outside the direct line of sight of the Selneri ships. Tommy knew the key to surviving was to use the element of surprise. The Selneri had no idea how Earth's crew would approach. They expected a quick charge, a direct attack, the usual way of doing things. Instead, Tommy's plan was simple: do the exact opposite. They wouldn't attack head-on. They'd do something unexpected, something the Selneri would never see coming. "All right, crew," Tommy said, his voice steady as he clicked a few buttons. "Here's the plan. We're going to fly straight at them, full speed. But when we get close, we'll make a sharp turn and veer off, right into the asteroid field." "You want us to go into an asteroid field?" Greg shouted from the rear of the ship. "Are you out of your mind?" Tommy didn't hesitate. If they're expecting us to fly straight at them, we're going to do the opposite. We'll make them chase us into the asteroid field. They won't be able to see us in there. We'll use it to shake them off our trail." The rest of the crew looked around, unsure of how this would work, but they trusted Tommy. He was their captain, after all, even if he was a bit of a wild card. "Then what?" Carl asked, his face lighting up with realization. "We lure them in, and then—" "Boom," Tommy finished for him. "We do what we do best. Create chaos." The plan was crazy, and that's what made it so dangerous and so brilliant. The HFY were the galaxy's top warriors. Their ships were fast and deadly. But they weren't prepared for a crew of unpredictable Earthlings who were willing to fly right into the heart of danger and make it up as they went along. As Tommy maneuvered the bender toward the HFY fleet, the tension inside the ship reached a boiling point. The crew watched the HFY ships grow larger in the viewports, their weapons bristling, ready to engage. "They're coming into range," Greg said, his eyes squinting through the rifle's scope, scanning the enemy fleet. "Get ready," Tommy murmured, his fingers dancing across the controls. He was calm, focused, a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding him. The plan was set in motion. Tommy pushed the throttle, and the bender shot forward, rocketing toward the HFY fleet. The crew braced themselves for impact, but at the last possible moment, Tommy yanked the controls to the left, sending the ship into a sharp turn. The HFY ships, expecting a direct hit, watched in confusion as the bender swerved out of their path, heading straight for the asteroid field. "Go! Go, go!" Tommy shouted as he guided the ship through the dense asteroid field, dodging massive rocks and debris. The HFY fleet, caught off guard, had no choice but to follow. But the smaller bender was faster, weaving through the asteroids, while the massive HFY ships struggled to keep up. "What now?" Carl shouted, looking over at Tommy. "Now we make them think we're running. We make them chase us. And then, when they're deep enough in, we'll strike." Tommy's eyes were burning with excitement. This was what he lived for: chaos, unpredictability, and the thrill of the unknown. The bender zigzagged through the asteroid field, narrowly avoiding giant chunks of rock, its engines roaring in protest as it pushed its limits. Tommy's hands moved with practiced precision, his eyes darting between the viewports and control panel, a man on the edge of his sanity, but somehow in control. Behind him, the rest of the crew was scattered across the ship, still buzzing with adrenaline from the unexpected maneuver. Carl was muttering to himself as he worked the ship's sensors, trying to track the movements of the HFY fleet. Greg had taken his position by the rear cannon, fingers tapping nervously against the weapon's trigger. "Do you think this is going to work?" Greg asked, the question tinged with uncertainty. The sniper wasn't used to unpredictability. He preferred a clean, calculated shot. This chaotic approach was something else entirely. Tommy's grin stretched wider, but his voice remained steady. "Trust me, Greg. They've got no idea what they're up against." The HFY fleet, trailing behind in hot pursuit, was finally catching up. Their ships, massive and imposing, slowly began to close in. The Earth crew had managed to shake them off for now, but they knew it wouldn't last long. The HFY weren't known for being easily outmaneuvered. In fact, they were almost terrifyingly efficient. "They're closing in fast," Carl reported. His fingers flew across the console, adjusting the ship's trajectory, trying to keep one step ahead. "We won't have much time before they get a lock on us." Tommy was quiet for a moment, his mind racing. He'd expected this. The bender wasn't built for straight-out speed or endurance. But the crew had something better: strategy. If they could just make it to the right spot, to the right distance, they could turn the tables. "You're right," Tommy said finally. "But we got one more move. Get ready." The crew had set the stage. The HFY were closing in, thinking they were moments away from making the kill. But they didn't know that their true threat was just a few steps ahead. We'll take a sharp right, then drop behind those smaller asteroids, Tommy ordered, his tone calm but with an edge of excitement. Once they get close enough, we'll make them think we're cornered. It'll be a surprise attack. What? You want to box them in? Greg asked, eyes widening. Are you sure that's going to work? It's going to work, Tommy said with quiet confidence. We're going to make them think they have us trapped, and then we'll pull the rug out from under them. The bender zoomed toward a dense cluster of medium-sized asteroids, which would offer them some cover. It was a dangerous maneuver, but Tommy had little time to waste. If they didn't strike soon, the Excelenary would catch up and overpower them. As the Excelenary fleet neared, Tommy gave the signal. The bender made a sharp turn, veering to the right, heading straight for the asteroid cluster. The large ships followed in pursuit, their sensors honed in on their target. For a moment, the crew's hearts seemed to stop as they hid behind a wall of jagged rocks. The Excelenary, growing overconfident, followed blindly. They thought they had trapped the small, reckless ship. Tommy's voice echoed through the comms. Now, Carl. Now. Carl, grinning, pressed a few buttons, engaging the ship's special maneuvering thrusters. The bender shot out from behind the cluster of asteroids like a rocket, flying at breakneck speed in the opposite direction of the Excelenary fleet. For a split second, the Excelenary were thrown off guard. They hesitated, trying to recalibrate their sensors and realign their focus, and that hesitation was all the crew of the bender needed. Fire! Greg shouted, his finger slamming down on the cannon trigger. The bender's rear cannon unleashed a barrage of firepower straight into the heart of the Excelenary fleet. The shockwave from the explosion reverberated through space, rattling the surrounding ships. It wasn't enough to destroy them, but it was enough to make them think twice. Got them, Greg said with a smirk, watching as the enemy ships struggled to regain their footing. They hadn't anticipated this. The human crew of the bender had done the impossible. They had outmaneuvered and wounded the invincible Excelenary. The Excelenary fleet, stunned and disoriented, pulled back. Their ships, once so sure of their dominance, now hesitated, regrouping and trying to reassess the situation. The crew of the bender, on the other hand, was already planning their next move. The Excelenary weren't fools. They would come at them again, and this time they'd be ready. But for now, Earth's wild, drunken crew had gained an upper hand, and that was all they needed. They had shown the galaxy's finest warriors that even the most chaotic of humans could pull off the unexpected. They had made their mark. The bender floated in the shadow of a massive moon, its engines humming quietly. The crew had taken refuge there, hoping to regroup and prepare for the next phase of their wild mission. Tommy sat at the cockpit, hands resting lightly on the controls, his mind racing. The victory against the Excelenary had been unexpected, but the real challenge was still looming ahead. How long until they regroup? Tommy asked, his voice calm but carrying a sense of urgency. Carl was busy scanning the space around them. They're still in the distance, but I don't trust it. They'd been quiet for too long. Greg was back at the rear cannon, testing the weapon, his fingers tapping nervously. They've got to be planning something. You don't just let a hit like that slide. Tommy nodded. He had the same gut feeling. The Excelenary weren't going to retreat forever. They were a highly disciplined race, and the defeat they'd suffered at the hands of Earth's wild crew was a blow to their pride. They'd be back, and they'd be smarter about it. As the hours ticked by, the crew stayed on edge, preparing for the worst. They all knew that the Excelenary didn't play by the same rules. When they struck back, it wouldn't be in the same reckless way as before. Tommy had already put the crew through a crash course in strategy, but the real test was coming. Without warning, the ship's sensors suddenly blared to life, the shrill alarm echoing through the ship. Tommy, they're coming in hot, Carl shouted, his voice laced with a mixture of fear and excitement. He was already working to plot a course, but the Excelenary were already closing in. Tommy's eyes narrowed as he watched the red blips on the screen. Brace yourselves. It's time to face them head-on. The bender shot forward, dodging asteroid fragments as it zoomed into the black abyss. Behind them, the Selnary fleet was fast approaching, their ships moving with precision, closing the gap with frightening speed. Tommy could see the outlines of their vessels growing larger, and he knew they were preparing to unleash hell. "They're here," Greg muttered, leaning into his station as he aimed the cannon, ready for the first shot. Carl looked over at Tommy. "What now?" Tommy grinned, but his eyes were focused, sharp. "Now we play their game. Let's see how they like a little bit of chaos." The Selnary opened fire. Blinding flashes of energy lanced through the dark void of space, missiles and lasers cutting through the silence. The first volley missed, but the second was too close for comfort. The bender rocked violently as a blast grazed the hull, and sparks flew from one of the consoles. "Hold it steady," Tommy shouted as he gripped the controls, feeling the pull of the G-forces as he swerved the ship left and right, narrowly avoiding another strike. The bender coasted through the shadows of a nearby asteroid field, the crew silent for a moment as they recovered from the intense engagement. The ship's hull groaned in protest, showing the scars of battle. The harsh, cold emptiness of space felt almost peaceful compared to the chaos they had just faced. But Tommy knew better. The silence was temporary. The Selnary would come for them, and this time, they would be better prepared. "Status report," Tommy called, leaning back in his seat. His fingers still trembled from the close calls, but he couldn't afford to show it. Not now. Carl was already at his station, eyes flicking over the control panel. "Shields are down to 35%. We've got enough to make another hit, but after that, we're on our own." Greg's voice crackled through the comms, his tone grim. "We need to get some serious distance. I don't care how we do it, but we need to put more space between us and them." Tommy's gaze shifted to the rear monitor, where the remnants of the Selnary fleet were still in pursuit. The ships were fast and disciplined, but they had learned a valuable lesson today. Earth's wild crew wasn't going down without a fight. Tommy couldn't help but feel a rush of pride. These were his people, the ones who fought with heart, not strategy. And now they had to pull off something even crazier than before. Tommy thought for a moment. "We need to split them up. If we can separate the Selnary ships, we'll have a better chance at taking them down one by one." Carl raised an eyebrow. "How do you propose we do that?" "I'm thinking something loud. Something big. Something unexpected." Greg's voice piped up. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" Tommy gave a slow grin. "Exactly. Time to play our trump card." The crew had been keeping something hidden, a secret weapon. It wasn't a traditional weapon like the Selnary preferred. It wasn't sleek or powerful, but it was chaotic, and chaos was exactly what Tommy needed. The bender turned toward the nearest planet, a rocky, barren world with an erratic atmosphere and unpredictable gravity. There was no reason for the Selnary to even be interested in this planet, but Tommy knew better. It wasn't about the planet itself. It was about the element of surprise. "All right, here's the plan," Tommy began, his voice calm and steady as he laid out the strategy. "We head toward the planet and make it look like we're trying to escape into its atmosphere. The Selnary will follow us, thinking we're running. And once they're in range," he paused for dramatic effect, "we hit them with everything we've got." Carl frowned. "That's risky. If they catch on before we can pull it off, we'll be sitting ducks." Tommy's eyes gleamed with determination. "That's why we're doing it now. The longer we wait, the harder it gets. We've got one shot at this." As the bender made its way toward the planet, the crew worked in unison. Carl prepared the ship's systems for a sudden burst of speed, while Greg loaded up the ship's cannons with the last of their power cells. They had limited resources left, but if this plan worked, they wouldn't need much. As they approached the planet's dense atmosphere, Tommy gripped the controls tightly. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was focused. He couldn't afford to second-guess himself now. The HFY would be right behind them, and once they entered the planet's atmosphere, they would lose their advantage. The clock was ticking. "Ready?" Tommy asked, his voice cutting through the tension. The crew was silent for a beat before Greg spoke up. "Ready." "Then let's make some noise." Tommy hit the button to engage the ship's thrusters, and the bender shot forward, diving toward the planet's surface at breakneck speed. The HFY followed suit, confident that the humans were running scared. But what they didn't know was that Tommy wasn't running at all. He was leading them into a trap. The bender dove deeper into the atmosphere, the ship shuddering as it fought against the planet's gravity. The air crackled with static as the ship's shields flared up, protecting them from the harsh elements of the planet's surface. The HFY were right behind them, their ships pressing in, unaware that the humans had a trick up their sleeves. Then, just as they reached the planet's lower atmosphere, Tommy pulled the ship into a sharp, unexpected turn, heading straight for a massive cliffside. The HFY ships, unable to match the maneuver in time, flew straight into the planet's surface, colliding with rocks and debris. "Now, Greg," Tommy shouted. Greg unleashed the ship's cannons, firing a barrage of deadly blasts into the HFY ships as they struggled to regain control. The impact of the missiles sent shockwaves through the atmosphere, causing massive explosions that lit up the sky like fireworks. It was chaos, but the crew was ready. The HFY fleet had been caught off guard. The remaining ships scrambled to regroup, but the damage was already done. Several ships were destroyed, and the ones that remained were in disarray. The crew of the bender watched in stunned silence as the battlefield unfolded before them. "Did we do it?" Carl whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Tommy let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "We did. But this isn't over. They'll come back stronger next time." But for now, they had won. Against all odds, they had taken down the HFY elite, with nothing but chaos, unpredictability, and a wild gamble. The bender's crew had proven that sometimes the greatest weapon was their ability to think on their feet and fight with everything they had. And that's exactly what they planned to do again. The bender coasted through the shadows of a nearby asteroid field, the crew silent for a moment as they recovered from the intense engagement. The ship's hull groaned in protest, showing the scars of battle. The harsh, cold emptiness of space felt almost peaceful compared to the chaos they had just faced. But Tommy knew better. The silence was temporary. The HFY would come for them. And this time, they would be better prepared. "Status report," Tommy called, leaning back in his seat. His fingers still trembled from the close calls, but he couldn't afford to show it. Not now. Carl was already at his station, eyes flicking over the control panel. "Shields are down to 35%. We've got enough to make another hit. But after that, we're on our own." Greg's voice crackled through the comms, his tone grim. "We need to get some serious distance. I don't care how we do it, but we need to put more space between us and them." Tommy's gaze shifted to the rear monitor, where the remnants of the HFY fleet were still in pursuit. The ships were fast and disciplined, but they had learned a valuable lesson today. Earth's wild crew wasn't going down without a fight. Tommy couldn't help but feel a rush of pride. These were his people, the ones who fought with heart, not strategy. And now they had to pull off something even crazier than before. Tommy thought for a moment. "We need to split them up. If we can separate the HFY ships, we'll have a better chance at taking them down one by one." Carl raised an eyebrow. "How do you propose we do that?" "I'm thinking something loud. Something big. Something unexpected." Greg's voice piped up. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" Tommy gave a slow grin. "Exactly. Time to play our trump card." The crew had been keeping something hidden, a secret weapon. It wasn't a traditional weapon like the HFY preferred. It wasn't sleek or powerful, but it was chaotic, And chaos was exactly what Tommy needed. The bender turned toward the nearest planet, a rocky, barren world with an erratic atmosphere and unpredictable gravity. There was no reason for the Selenary to even be interested in this planet. But Tommy knew better. It wasn't about the planet itself. It was about the element of surprise. "All right, here's the plan," Tommy began, his voice calm and steady as he laid out the strategy. "We head toward the planet and make it look like we're trying to escape into its atmosphere. The Selenary will follow us, thinking we're running. And once they're in range," he paused for dramatic effect, "we hit them with everything we've got." Carl frowned. "That's risky. If they catch on before we can pull it off, we'll be sitting ducks." Tommy's eyes gleamed with determination. "That's why we're doing it now. The longer we wait, the harder it gets. We've got one shot at this." As the bender made its way toward the planet, the crew worked in unison. Carl prepared the ship's systems for a sudden burst of speed, while Greg loaded up the ship's cannons with the last of their power cells. They had limited resources left, but if this plan worked, they wouldn't need much. As they approached the planet's dense atmosphere, Tommy gripped the controls tightly. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was focused. He couldn't afford to second-guess himself now. The Selenary would be right behind them. And once they entered the planet's atmosphere, they would lose their advantage. The clock was ticking. "Ready?" Tommy asked, his voice cutting through the tension. The crew was silent for a beat before Greg spoke up. "Ready. Then let's make some noise." Tommy hit the button to engage the ship's thrusters, and the bender shot forward, diving toward the planet's surface at breakneck speed. The Selenary followed suit, confident that the humans were running scared. But what they didn't know was that Tommy wasn't running at all. He was leading them into a trap. The bender dove deeper into the atmosphere, the ship shuddering as it fought against the planet's gravity. The air crackled with static as the ship's shields flared up, protecting them from the harsh elements of the planet's surface. The Selenary were right behind them, their ships pressing in, unaware that the humans had a trick up their sleeves. Then, just as they reached the planet's lower atmosphere, Tommy pulled the ship into a sharp, unexpected turn, heading straight for a massive cliffside. The Selenary ships, unable to match the maneuver in time, flew straight into the planet's surface, colliding with rocks and debris. "Now, Greg," Tommy shouted. Greg unleashed the ship's cannons, firing a barrage of deadly blasts into the Selenary ships as they struggled to regain control. The impact of the missiles sent shockwaves through the atmosphere, causing massive explosions that lit up the sky like fireworks. It was chaos, but the crew was ready. The Selenary fleet had been caught off guard. The remaining ships scrambled to regroup, but the damage was already done. Several ships were destroyed, and the ones that remained were in disarray. The crew of the bender watched in stunned silence as the battlefield unfolded before them. "Did we do it?" Carl whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Tommy let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "We did. But this isn't over. They'll come back stronger next time." But for now, they had won. Against all odds, they had taken down the Selenary elite, with nothing but chaos, unpredictability, and a wild gamble. The bender's crew had proven that sometimes the greatest weapon was their ability to think on their feet and fight with everything they had. And that's exactly what they planned to do again. The bender flew high above the rocky world, its engines still humming from the recent battle. The crew was exhausted, but they knew this wasn't the time to relax. The Selenary had been dealt a significant blow, but they were far from finished. Tommy knew that the fight wasn't over. It was only a matter of time before the alien empire would send reinforcements, and the humans weren't prepared for what was coming. The crew had a brief respite, but it didn't last long. Soon, the radar began to blip with incoming signals, and the familiar, menacing shapes of Selenary ships filled the screen. They were back, and this time, they weren't coming alone. "They've brought the big guns," Carl said, his voice tinged with fear. "A whole fleet. And they're not here to play games." Tommy clenched his fists around the controls. He didn't have to tell them that this was their final chance. If they couldn't stop the Accelerary now, humanity's fate would be sealed. The entire galaxy had seen how far the Accelerary had come, but they'd also seen what humanity was capable of when pushed to the brink. "They sent their best last time," Tommy muttered. "This time, we fight smarter. And we hit them harder." He looked over at Greg, who was busy checking the ship's weapons systems. "Any chance we got something left to surprise them with?" Greg grinned, though it was a tired grin. "Oh, I've got a few tricks up my sleeve, but we're going to need to be quick. We can't keep dodging forever." Tommy's eyes narrowed, scanning the incoming fleet. There were too many ships, far too many. But there was one thing the Accelerary didn't have that the humans did: unpredictability. The Bender's crew knew they were outnumbered, but they weren't backing down. The Accelerary were methodical, always predictable in their strategy. It was exactly what Tommy was counting on. "All right," Tommy said, his voice calm but sharp. "Here's what we do. We play their game, but we twist the rules. We'll pretend we're running again. Draw them in close. Once they're right on our tail, we hit them with everything we've got." Carl raised an eyebrow. "You want us to run again?" Tommy nodded. "Yes, but this time, we'll make sure they think they've got us cornered. When they're right in our grasp, we strike hard, and we strike fast." The Bender took off, skirting the edges of the asteroid field. The Accelerary fleet followed, their ships weaving in perfect formation. They were confident, too confident. The humans were making the same mistake again, or so they thought. Tommy led them in, darting through the asteroid field, as though trying to escape into the depths of space. But Tommy wasn't running. He was waiting for the right moment. As they drew closer to the massive gravitational pull of a nearby planet, Tommy engaged the ship's cloaking system for just a split second. It wasn't much, but it was enough to throw off the Accelerary's tracking systems. Their ships lost the Bender for a fraction of a second, just enough to give them a glimpse of what Tommy had been planning all along. The Accelerary opened fire, thinking they had the Bender locked in their sights. But Tommy had already anticipated their move. He sharply pulled the ship out of their firing range, diving straight into the planet's lower atmosphere. The Accelerary were left to follow, completely unaware of the trap that had been set for them. "Now," Tommy shouted. Greg fired the ship's remaining missiles into the lead Accelerary ship. The explosive impact sent the enemy vessel careening off course, but it wasn't enough. The rest of the fleet was still in hot pursuit, desperate to catch up. Carl didn't hesitate. He engaged the Bender's afterburners and shot toward the atmosphere's edge. The Accelerary were too close, their ships tailing them, relentless in their pursuit. But Tommy had one more card to play. The Bender didn't just have firepower, it had speed. With one last burst, they rocketed upward, pushing the ship past its limits. The Accelerary fleet, unable to keep up, watched as the Bender escaped their grasp, at least for now. Tommy's voice came over the comms, low and steady. "We're not done yet, but we've bought ourselves a little more time." As the Bender broke through the planet's atmosphere, the Accelerary fleet regrouped. They were angry, but the humans had proven something that they hadn't expected. Humans weren't easily defeated. And with one last desperate move, Tommy had bought them enough time to make their final stand. They had no more tricks left, no more surprise moves, but what they did have was the heart of a fighter. And that was enough to give the humans the edge they needed. "We've got one chance left," Tommy said, his eyes steely with determination. "And we're going to take it." The final showdown was coming. The Accelerary wouldn't stop until they had destroyed humanity, but the crew of the Bender wasn't going to let that happen. They were ready to fight to the last breath. And they weren't going down without a fight. The Bender soared through the cold void of space, its engines barely holding together after the intense battle. Tommy leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the view screen. The culinary fleet, though battered and broken, were still in pursuit, determined to finish what they had started. There was no turning back now. The humans had come this far, and Tommy wasn't about to let their enemies destroy everything they had fought for. The crew had already made the necessary repairs to the ship, but they were running low on power. Their ammunition was almost depleted, and their shields were nearly gone. It would only take one more heavy blow from the HFY, and they would be done. But Tommy wasn't going to let that happen. They had fought too hard, sacrificed too much. "All right, everyone, listen up." Tommy's voice rang out, steady but filled with determination. "This is it. No more running. We stand our ground, and we end this once and for all." Carl, who had been working on the ship's weapons systems, looked up from his console. "You sure about this, boss? We've got nothing left. No tricks, no surprises, just us and them." Tommy nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Sometimes the only thing you have left is your will to survive, and we're not going to let them win." The culinary ships were closing in, their sleek, dark forms casting long shadows across the vast expanse of space. Tommy could see their weapons charging, ready to unleash everything they had in a final assault. He gripped the controls tightly, knowing that the next few minutes would determine the fate of humanity. The crew had been preparing for this moment. They had used their last reserves of energy to keep the bender in fighting condition, and they knew that every move they made from here on out had to count. There was no room for mistakes. "Focus," Tommy muttered under his breath. "Focus and fight." The HFY opened fire first, their weapons glowing brightly as they unleashed a barrage of lasers. The bender swerved to avoid the first few shots, but the ship's speed couldn't save it forever. A blast hit the starboard side, causing the ship to shudder violently. "Damage report," Tommy shouted, his eyes flicking to the control panel. Carl was already on it. "Shields down to 15%, hull integrity at 60%. We're holding, but not for long." Tommy didn't flinch. He had known it was coming. This was their last stand. "All right, get us in close. We need to make them regret this." Greg, who had been standing by, nodded. "You heard him. Let's give them everything we've got." The bender turned sharply, darting toward the closest culinary ship. The crew was ready. They had no more tricks to pull out, but they had their instincts. Tommy watched the distance between the two ships shrink, knowing that the next few moments would determine everything. His hands moved with practiced precision, his heart pounding in his chest. The culinary ships didn't expect the humans to get this close. They had always relied on their superior firepower and tactics to keep the humans at bay. But now, with everything on the line, Tommy knew they had one last chance to catch the aliens off guard. With a swift motion, Tommy aimed the ship's cannons and fired. The blast hit the culinary ship with a force that shook the entire bender. The explosion was massive, lighting up the darkness of space. The culinary ship began to break apart, pieces of debris floating in the vacuum of space. "Got one," Greg yelled, a triumphant grin on his face. But there were still more. The remaining culinary ships were reeling from the unexpected assault, but they quickly regained their composure. Their weapons were charging again, and this time they weren't holding back. "Brace for impact," Carl shouted. Tommy slammed the ship's throttle forward, pushing the bender to its maximum speed as the culinary fired another barrage of energy blasts. The ship's shields flared brightly, but they were weakening fast. The hull groaned under the strain, but Tommy kept the ship steady, weaving through the incoming fire with precision. Just as the next wave of culinary shots closed in on them, Tommy hit the maneuvering thrusters, causing the bender to twist and turn at an impossible angle. The shots narrowly missed, but Tommy knew they couldn't keep this up forever. They were running out of time. Then, something unexpected happened. One of the culinary ships, its weapons fully charged and ready for the final strike, began to pull away from the fight. At first, Tommy thought it was a mistake, a retreat. But then, a loud alarm blared from the control panel, signaling an incoming transmission. "Hold on," Tommy muttered. "What's this?" A holographic message flickered into view, a figure appearing before the crew. It was a Salinary commander, her cold alien face twisted in anger. "You think you can defy us?" she spat. "You fought well, human, but this ends now. You may have defeated our elite, but the Empire will never forgive this. Your kind will be eradicated." Tommy's eyes narrowed, his fists tightening on the controls. He wasn't about to let some alien threaten humanity. He had already seen what the Salinary were capable of. He knew they had underestimated him before, and they were about to do it again. "You think we'll just give up?" Tommy said with a steady voice, a fire burning in his eyes. "No, we fight for our future, and we'll make sure you know why humanity will never be beaten." In that moment, something inside Tommy clicked. The crew of the Bender had always fought as individuals, relying on their instincts, their wit, and their ability to adapt. But now, they were fighting as one. They knew they weren't just defending themselves. They were defending every human being, every colony, every family that depended on them. "We'll see you in hell," Tommy growled, his voice low and fierce. He slammed the ship's throttle forward again, pushing the Bender straight into the heart of the Salinary fleet. The ship shook with the impact of another barrage, but this time, the crew didn't back down. They fired back with everything they had. And as the Bender hurtled toward the enemy, one thing was certain: humanity wasn't going down without the fight of a lifetime.